My name is Eliza, and in many ways, I am just an ordinary woman. My hands are often callous from hours spent working with soil, and my days are filled with the quiet joy of tending to gardens. Gardening is more than a passion for me, it is a language, a form of meditation, and a reminder that life, no matter how small, carries within it a kind of magic. There is something deeply humbling about watching a tiny seed push through the soil, reaching for the sun, and becoming something vibrant and beautiful. For years, my love for gardening was simply a part of who I was. But after my husband passed away, transformed into something far greater, it became a sanctuary, a lifeline, and my way of finding purpose again. The garden wasn't just a patch of earth anymore. It was my way of mending the fractures that grief had carved into my soul. During those days of mourning, I found work tending the garden of a man named Mr. Walker. He was 73 years old, his face weathered with time, and his voice carried the weight of long years lived without the one he loved most. His wife had passed away many years earlier, and since then, the garden that had once been her pride and joy had fallen into disrepair. I still remember our first meeting with vivid clarity. He stood on his patio, leaning slightly on his cane, surveying the overgrown garden before him. The roses were drooping, their once vibrant petals curling at the edges, as if they too felt the absence of the care they once received. Weeds had crept into every corner, overtaking flower beds and winding their way up trellises that once held flourishing vines. The stone pathways were hidden beneath layers of moss and dirt, and the air carried the faint, melancholy scent of decay. "It used to be her pride and joy," he murmured, his voice barely audible. He wasn't speaking to me but to the ghosts of memories that lingered there. His eyes were distant, as though he was seeing not the garden as it was but as it had once been, a lively, colorful oasis full of his wife's laughter and warmth. His words touched me deeply. I could see that this was not just a neglected patch of land. It was a sacred space, a reflection of the love and life they had shared. I didn't know it then, but this garden and Mr. Walker would soon become a profound part of my own healing journey. First, our interactions were brief and polite. Mr. Walker would nod in acknowledgement as I worked, and I would offer him a small smile. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice the subtle ways he lingered on the patio, watching as I pruned the roses or pulled stubborn weeds. His gaze would soften when he spoke about his late wife, and each story he shared felt like a thread weaving a tapestry of a life once rich with companionship and joy. One day, as I was kneeling to clear a particularly tangled patch of weeds, he approached me. His movements were slow, deliberate, and in his hands, he held an old photograph. He extended it toward me with a trembling hand. "This is her," he said simply. The photo showed a radiant woman, her smile wide and her arms full of fresh blooms. She stood in the very garden I was working to restore, though it looked almost unrecognizable compared to its current state. Seeing her image, I felt a surge of determination. "I'll bring it back," promised, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'll make it beautiful again, just like she would have wanted." His response was a soft, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough. In that moment, I knew this wasn't just a job, it was a mission. It wasn't only about reviving the garden. It was about honoring the love it symbolized and helping Mr. Walker reconnect with the joy he thought he had lost forever. As I worked, I couldn't help but draw parallels to my own life. After my husband's death, I too had felt lost, untethered, as though the world had shifted in a way that left me perpetually off balance. Gardening became my anchor. There was something profoundly therapeutic about placing my hands in the soil, feeling its cool texture, and nurturing life from it. Each plant I tended felt like a small victory over the weight of my grief, a step toward rediscovering hope. One warm afternoon, as the sun cast golden rays over the garden, Mr. Walker approached me with a wicker basket in his hands. Inside were a few fresh oranges and a small jar of honey. "For you," he said, his voice tinged with gratitude. "A little thank you for everything you've done." I was touched by the gesture, not because of the items themselves but because of the thought behind them. It was a sign that the garden, and perhaps I, had begun to breathe life back into his world. "Thank you, Mr. Walker," I replied, smiling warmly. "This garden is special, just like the memories you've shared about your wife." From that day on, something shifted between us. He began to spend more time outside, sitting on the patio or walking among the flowers as they began to bloom once more. He shared stories about his wife, the way her laughter filled the house, the way she sang softly to herself as she planted, and I listened, not just with my ears but with my heart. Each story he told was like another seed planted in the garden, bringing it closer to the vibrant haven it had once been. And as the roses began to bloom again and the paths became visible once more, it felt as though we were both finding a way to heal. The garden, once a forgotten corner of sadness, was transforming into a place of renewal. And in the quiet moments, as I worked beside Mr. Walker, I realized that the garden was not the only thing being brought back to life. I listened intently because I understood what it meant to feel that kind of emptiness, that hollow ache of missing someone so deeply. Feels like a part of your soul has been misplaced. Loneliness has a way of carving its mark on you, but it also makes you attuned to others who bear the same weight. First, our conversations were simple. We talked about flowers, plants, and how the garden thrived under the summer sun. But as the days stretched on, the dialogue evolved. It wasn't just about blooms and pruning anymore. It became about life. We spoke of love and its losses, of the fleeting yet precious moments that give life its quiet beauty. I began to realize something profound during those talks. I wasn't just helping him tend his garden, watching roses bloom where once there were only withered stems. I was helping him heal pieces of himself that had been dormant for years. And in some inexplicable way, I found that I was healing too. One evening, when the air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the sky was painted in hues of gold and lavender, I found myself drawn to the old wooden bench by the rose bushes. The bench, weathered with age, had become a quiet sanctuary. I sat there, letting the stillness of the evening envelop me. The rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze was the only sound, a melody as soft and soothing as a lullaby. It wasn't long before Mr. Walker appeared. He moved slowly, his cane tapping lightly against the stone path, each step deliberate yet steady. He approached the bench without a word and lowered himself onto it with the kind of care one learns with age. For a while, we didn't speak. The silence between us was unspoken yet comfortable, a shared pause in the chaos of life. It was the kind of silence that didn't need filling, one that spoke louder than words ever could. I turned to look at him after a while. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, distant and contemplative, as though he were searching for something in the fading light of the sun. The moment felt fragile, almost sacred. Before I could overthink, I found myself speaking. "Do you ever miss being close to someone?" The question came out as a whisper, so quiet I wasn't sure he'd even heard it. He turned his head slowly to face me, his expression unreadable at first. But then he nodded, a small, deliberate motion that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "Every single day," he said softly, his voice tinged with an ache that mirrored my own. There was a rawness in his tone that made my chest tighten. It was rare to hear such honesty, even rarer to feel it resonate so deeply. In that moment, he wasn't just Mr. Walker, the elderly widower. He was a man stripped bare of titles and pretense, simply human, longing, vulnerable, and so very real. And in him, I saw my reflection. Gathering my courage, I spoke again. "I think we can help each other," I said gently, my hands nervously fiddling with the hem of my shirt. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine for something, reassurance, perhaps, or understanding. For a moment, I thought he might turn away, but instead, he stayed. "Help each other?" he repeated softly, the words hanging in the air between us. I nodded, my voice steady despite the nervous flutter in my chest. "Sometimes, we need to let someone in," I said, not to fix everything, but to remind us that we're not alone. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions. His gaze held mine, and in that exchange, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic or earth-shattering, but it was enough. Later that evening, After a quiet dinner and the rhythmic hum of the crickets outside, I invited him to my room. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but one born from a sense of trust that had quietly grown between us. My room was modest but cozy. The soft lamplight bathed the walls in a warm, golden hue, and I had arranged a tray of tea with delicate care. When he arrived, he lingered at the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame. "You don't have to," I said softly, sensing his hesitation. "This isn't about expectation. It's about sharing a moment where we don't have to feel so alone." Slowly, he stepped inside, his expression cautious but open. I gestured for him to sit on the small sofa near the window. As he settled in, the awkwardness began to dissolve. We started talking, the way we always did. First, it was about the little things, the scent of the jasmine outside, the sound of rain on the roof. Then, the conversation deepened. He told me stories about his wife, her favorite songs, and the way her laughter could light up a room. I shared my own memories of the garden I once planted with my grandmother and the quiet lessons she taught me about life. The night unfolded gently, like the turning of pages in an old, cherished book. It wasn't about grand gestures or declarations. It was about connection, two people, bruised by life, finding solace in each other's presence. By the time the tea had gone cold and the lamp's light had dimmed, I realized that something had shifted, not just in him, but in me as well. It was as if the loneliness we each carried had found a companion, no longer a burden to bear alone. And in that quiet, unassuming evening, something extraordinary had begun. A fragile yet profound bond that neither of us had expected but both of us desperately needed. It was more than enough to sit side by side, to share stories and laughter, to let the silence between us feel safe rather than empty. As we spent that time together, the weight of the world seemed to lift subtly from our shoulders. The moments we shared became a quiet sanctuary, a space where words were not always necessary because understanding existed beyond them. By the time the evening drew to a close, there was an unmistakable lightness in the air that hadn't been present before. I walked him to the door, his steps now surer, more confident. As he turned to thank me, his expression held something I hadn't seen before: peace. It was as if a calm had settled over him, a peace that spoke of contentment and resolution. When I closed the door behind him, felt it too. The house felt quieter, yet not empty. There was a sense of completion, a gentle warmth that lingered in the space where our conversation had flowed freely. The next morning, as I watched him walk back toward his house, a profound sense of peace enveloped me. The air was crisp, the sun bathed everything in its golden light, and the garden seemed alive, blooming with vibrant colors and renewed vitality. Yet, it wasn't merely the beauty of the morning that brought this tranquility. It was the memory of the night before that continued to ripple through my thoughts. In offering him comfort, companionship, and understanding, I found that I had, in some quiet way, found comfort for myself as well. The feeling wasn't something I could easily put into words. It was more of a subtle, profound sense of connection. Felt as though, in reaching out to him, I had touched a part of my own healing that had eluded me for far too long. Life is unpredictable, isn't it? One moment you're walking along a familiar path, and the next, the road shifts in ways you never anticipated. It has a peculiar way of drawing people together, intertwining lives in ways that seem unlikely or even impossible. Yet, those unexpected moments often carry the most profound significance. They remind us that even in the midst of darkness, when loneliness, loss, and grief loom large, there is always a flicker of light, a thread of hope. A simple smile, a shared laugh, or a moment of understanding can become powerful anchors in moments of despair. They have the capacity to push back the shadows, if only for a while, and illuminate a world that can feel heavy and overwhelming. As I returned to my work in the garden, I felt a renewed sense of purpose and joy. The soil beneath my hands felt softer, more nurturing. The roses seemed to bloom with an added vibrancy, and the birdsong in the trees resonated with a deeper harmony. Every task, whether pulling weeds or pruning branches, felt infused with meaning. As I tended to the garden, my thoughts often drifted back to Mr. Walker and the stories we shared. It wasn't just a simple friendship, it was a profound connection built on presence, understanding, and shared moments of vulnerability. This bond we had formed was a beautiful kind of simplicity, a quiet, yet deeply significant relationship that didn't require grand declarations or expectations. It was enough to simply be there for one another, to hold space, and to offer support in the most authentic way possible. I knew, as I worked the soil and admired the garden's growth, that this was only the beginning. Mr. Walker and I had shared something beautiful, a fleeting, yet meaningful experience. It was a quiet promise we had made to ourselves, to continue finding light and connection in these moments, however fleeting they may be. Thank you for taking the time to watch our videos. If you find the content useful and interesting, don't forget to like, share, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Our channel will always update attractive, inspiring, and useful content for you. Click the bell icon to receive notifications as soon as there are new videos. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue to develop. Thank you and see you in the next videos.